Welcome to our first virtual talk of Campus Sustainability Month 2024. My name is Danielle. I'm the Sustainability Manager with the Office of Sustainability and Campus Enrichment. This is our first of 4 virtual talks put on by our amazing sustainability interns. These are undergraduate students who have been working with our office since the start of the semester. They've developed these talks on topics they're curious about and taken the research and prepared a presentation to share what they've learned with you. To kick us off, you'll be hearing from Matthew and Peyton. Matthew's a senior in environmental geoscience, and Peyton is a sophomore in meteorology. Their talk, Should I Stay or Should I Go? What Hurricane Ratings Fail to Communicate, is focused on understanding the full scope of hurricane hazards beyond that which is considered in our current rating systems, and how that knowledge is critical for your safety during extreme weather events. A timely talk as we watch stories of recovery and resilience across much of the southeastern U.S. after Hurricane Helene, and in particular across Florida after Hurricane Milton this week. A couple of things to note before we get started. I've pinned Peyton, Matthew, and myself, so you should get to see our smiling faces throughout this, but suggest if you can move your Zoom into side-by-side mode, you'll get the best experience. I'm going to turn on a live transcript once we get started. That should create some captions, automatic captions. And then there is a Q&A box. You can drop questions in there or in the chat, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation as time allows. And then the last piece is, please know when you entered, it should have told you we're recording. We're recording this so we can put it on our YouTube channel after and share more widely to people who were not available to be here with us in person. On that note, because you are here in person, you're going to get some code words today. So keep careful attention to the presentation. Matthew and Peyton are going to drop a code word during part of the talk. Make sure you write that down and keep it so that you can enter into our giveaway at the end of Campus Sustainability Month. There's some details on the screen here. Because you're joining in person, I'm also going to drop an additional 4 code words in the chat, so you'll get a total of 5 for being with us in person. And so watch for those in the chat as well. A few plugs before we get started. We've opened applications for sustainability internships. So if you like what you hear here and you're an undergraduate student in any major, now's the time to apply to join us for the spring semester. We love having diverse students from all different backgrounds coming in with us. It makes my job amazing to learn from all of these students. Promo, some of the prizes that you can be winning this month for those code words. Tier 1 has things like a $250 tuition scholarship or some really cool Yeti coolers. Tier 2 has things like a 1-year Veo Ride membership, some really cool bath sheets, things that have gone over well in the past is the hammock here. And I guess you don't get to know what Tier 3 is because it's not on here. Our Tier 3 prizes, I can't think what they include right now. I know a solar charger is one of them. But in terms of our campus sustainability programming, things that you should know that are up next is October 16th is Campus Sustainability Day from 10 to 1 in Redder Plaza. Rev will be there at 11, big draw. Make sure you come out to get your photo with Rev. And our interns will be there tabling with some really cool activities as well. I'm very excited for it. Some photos from last year's Earth Month and previous Campus Sustainability Months. After that, we have 3 more intern talks coming. So on the 18th, next Friday, it's Wolves, Bison, and Bears, Oh My. This is the history of conservation and the national parks in the U.S. Then is Fair Trade Truly Effective? Our interns are looking at the cocoa or chocolate industry and the fashion industry. And then finally, the Hitchhiker's Guide to Urban Sprawl. And if you are a nerd like me and know the references in here, I've gotten a little preview of this and I literally laugh out loud at some of these references to a great book. So come join us on the 23rd for our last of the month. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Peyton and Matthew.
Hello, and welcome to our presentation. Thank you guys for coming. I'm Peyton,
And I'm Matthew.
and without further ado, let's just jump right into it. You're probably familiar with hurricanes, especially those in the Gulf, and there's probably quite a few of you who have lived through one or at least a lot of its effects. But have you ever thought about how we categorize those storms? Since the early 1970s, we've used something called the Saffir-Simpson scale. The Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale was developed in the 1960s, and it assigned categories 1 through 5, with 1 being the weakest and 5 being the strongest, to a hurricane that were based on a storm's sustained wind speeds, estimated surface pressure, and storm surge, and it did also include descriptions of potential property damage. However, the scale was released prematurely because of some political pressure before the storm surge and surface pressure ratings were truly refined. And the flaws from the system were made pretty obvious with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. That led to the storm surge and flooding information being removed in 2009, which then prompted the system to be renamed the Saffir-Simpson Hurricane Wind Scale. And that kind of reflects that the scale currently only directly accounts for wind speed. Now, when I'm talking about this, you might think, oh, well, that sounds good. Like that's what we've used for 50 years. And that's just normal to us. But many people, including scientists, do take issue with the way we rate hurricanes. So what's wrong? Remember when I said we've actually removed some of the factors in the scale? Well, as you might guess, those factors do actually affect the hurricane impacts. There's even more influences than storm surge and surface pressure too, including wind speed, regional geography, storm speed, size, rainfall, and even more. And yet the only thing the Saffir-Simpson scale accounts for is wind. So all of this is to say, and I'll reiterate this a couple times, lots of factors influence the impacts from a hurricane far beyond the wind alone. And one of the biggest things to remember, and can't stress this enough, is that the category of a hurricane does not equal its impacts. For instance, storm surge is actually the most damaging part of a hurricane, and it's the main reason we end up evacuating, but it has a non-linear relationship with the wind speed, so it's not properly accounted for in the Saffir-Simpson scale. Winds are certainly hazardous, but they can't compare to the strength of water because storm surge is basically when the sea level rises due to the water being pushed ahead of the storm, which can cause massive damage and even sweep whole houses away. And depending on the storm's strength and the tides, that water can actually rise a lot. As an example, let's look at Hurricane Helene, which recently made landfall on September 26th of this year. Storm surge is, of course, only one of the many deadly impacts of the storm, but it did exemplify the importance of geography in determining the severity of that surge that we saw. What you're looking at here is an estimated storm surge map from the day before landfall. The purple areas correspond to the highest estimated storm surge, and the location of the highest estimates is certainly no coincidence. The depression in the coastline here, which I like to kind of think of as a bite is taken out of it, is essentially acting as a funnel for that water and intensifying the surge in that part of Florida. And that is kind of where the eye passed when it came through. Although I did not have official numbers at the time of creating the slide, which wasn't very long ago, but this hurricane was quite recent, the National Weather Service in Tallahassee has reported an estimated 15 feet of storm surge for parts of their forecast area, and it is possible that it could have been higher in some areas. You can see that on the graphic, the estimated surge was 15 to 20 feet. If you look at the storm surge graphic from NOAA, particularly on the right side, that's above your house if it's a single story, and it could very well be well into your second story if you do have a two-story house. That is quite dangerous and that can cause serious damage. The continental shelf also plays a role in storm surge. As you're going to see in this video, a shelf with more gradual slope will have a higher storm surge, whereas a shelf with a steep slope is somewhat protected from the rising waters and will have a lesser storm surge. So what you're seeing is a gradual increase in the strength of the storm, which becomes a little more evident in the way the wind affects the trees. You can see them getting blown further and further over. As the hurricane gets stronger, the storm surge gets higher and starts to damage the house. And notice how the house just eventually gets swept away. Water has a lot of power, which is what makes storm surge so dangerous. In the second part of the video, which you're seeing now, you can see that the continental shelf is much steeper this time. This effectively protects the coast from the storm surge to some extent. Obviously, you're still going to see damage. It's just less so. As in the first clip, the storm is starting weaker, and now you can see that it's very much strengthened. The storm surge has become much deeper. Again, don't underestimate the water. Storm surge is really dangerous. Another factor in hurricane impacts is the speed the storm is going to move through an area, which affects both the storm surge and the flooding. The graphic here is depicting two different hypothetical hurricanes that hit the same area and had the same rating. The scale shows the brighter areas, such as the red areas, had the highest storm surge, and the cooler colored areas, such as the blue, experienced relatively less storm surge, and gray would be no storm surge. This shows that the storm on the left, which moved faster, you can see kind of from that line that kind of shows how often the observations were taken. You can see how far apart they are. That means the storm was moving quickly. It generated a higher storm surge, but it was generally closer to the coastline. So you can see all that red concentrated on the coast. The slower moving storm on the right, on the other hand, has lower peak surges, so less red, that reach further inland. So you can see kind of how far that extends back from the coastline of the coloring. So this means that the speed of a hurricane affects the regions that will be impacted by the storm surge and consequently how severe the impacts of that storm will be in those regions. Beyond storm surge, the storm's speed also affects rainfall and consequently flooding. Slower storms generally mean more rainfall because they remain over the same area for a much longer period of time. This was the case with Hurricane Harvey in 2017, which dumped water on Houston for about 4 days, which is quite a long time for a tropical storm to linger over that relatively small area. Despite the eye or the center of the storm of the hurricane making landfall approximately 30 miles northeast of Corpus Christi, notably not in Houston, the storm was unusual in that it stalled over Texas. In particular, Houston had much of the impact, as we know, and suffered intense flooding, which has taken many years to recover from. In some instances, we're still recovering, and it caught many residents unprepared because of the unusual nature of the storm. It actually broke the previous state record of 48 inches of rainfall from a hurricane because it had a maximum of 60.58 inches of rain in one place, and that wasn't even the only place the record was broken. It was broken in quite a few places. This is just the most recorded rain in one area. In fact, according to a NOAA analysis, the flood was a 1 in 1,000 year flood for many of the areas affected. That means that according to probability, that sort of flooding would only occur once every 1,000 years. Of the 68 direct deaths from Hurricane Harvey, all except for 3 were from freshwater flooding, which, as you can probably guess, was the result of that heavy rain. So you might be asking, what about size? And of course, that's important too. So we're going to start by defining a couple of important terms. Storm intensity is referencing wind speeds, and storm size is referring to a storm's radius. More specifically, that radius is the radius of the maximum winds in the storm. So here's another graphic, similar to the hurricane speed one from before, but depicting the effects of storm intensity instead. Again, red is the highest storm surge and gray is no storm surge. Stronger winds will create higher storm surges. This is one of the easiest factors of storm surge to correlate with the Saffir-Simpson scale because storm intensity and the wind speeds are directly related in this sense. So the image on the left shows the storm surge from a Category 2 hurricane, and the image on the right shows the surge from a Category 3 hurricane. The Category 3 storm, which would have a greater intensity because a Cat 3 corresponds to higher wind speeds on the Saffir-Simpson scale, does come with a greater storm surge. And generally, the larger the storm, the higher the storm surge. This video demonstrates that concept really well, and it occurs for a couple of reasons. The winds in a larger storm physically affect a larger area of the ocean, and those winds also tend to impact an area for longer than in a smaller storm, which allows the storm surge to build ahead of the incoming storm. So you can see that the hypothetical stronger storm on the bottom pushes way more water out in front of it, and in this case, the water must rise upwards to create a greater storm surge because obviously there's an ocean bottom blocking the bottom of it. So the smaller radius, on the other hand, allows more water to escape around it, and that's why we see a lesser storm surge. You may have also heard that climate change is affecting hurricanes, but how so? It turns out that we've seen an uptick in the intensity of tropical cyclones in more recent years. This is in part because ocean waters are warming, and therefore they provide more fuel or energy to the storm. For instance, over the past couple of weeks, the Gulf has been abnormally warm, and that's why Hurricane Milton recently got so intense so fast. We saw it rapidly intensify to a Category 5 in the past few days. Some scientists have argued that since the Saffir-Simpson scale is open-ended, meaning there's no upper bound on the highest category of 5, it cannot represent these more intense storms properly. The wind speeds are far higher than the minimum to become a Category 5, and people may underperceive that hurricane's danger. They have proposed adding a potential higher Category 6 to the scale to help remedy this issue, but the scientists also emphasize the importance of also accounting for other hurricane effects, kind of like the Saffir-Simpson scale did originally. For instance, let's go back to storm surge. Given sea levels are rising due to climate change, the higher the sea level is, the more water is closer to the buildings on the shoreline, which means that the storm surges can be both deeper and further inland, causing much more damage. This storm surge category would, of course, be good to add if modifying the Saffir-Simpson scale or also creating a new hurricane scale, because it's really important to account for, as you can probably tell from how much we've talked about storm surge. So quick interruption, here's your code word. It's Saffir-Simpson. Make sure to record it and submit it for Sustainability Month.
All right, thank you, Peyton. So what does this mean for public safety and how does this shape the public response to storms? So the Saffir-Simpson's categories are often the only method of communicating the dangers of a hurricane to the public. It's rare to see news outlets or storm warnings use literally any other metric. This makes the categories quite important for hurricane risk communication. An example of this that you often see is these end of season graphics, which displays the storm season's history on news sites or Wikipedia. These summaries play an important role in record keeping and make use of the Saffir-Simpson scale. As you can see, the storm tracks are tracked with the Saffir-Simpson intensity. This isn't all bad. The Saffir-Simpson scale does serve as an anchor for people. It can serve as like a frame of reference for people to compare their past experiences to. However, everyone's perception of these hurricane dangers is different, and this sort of relativistic, opinionated look at the categories can often lead to public responses that don't always fit the danger. So how does this shape public safety? The categories, like Peyton said, sort of define how the public will respond to a storm. A study by Poland in 2023 found that 75.5% of the people surveyed were influenced to evacuate by the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind speed. And the frankly arbitrary designation of Category 3 for major hurricanes, 35.3 would only evacuate for them for a Category 3 plus. This is beyond unsafe. Hurricane Katrina, pictured here, was only a Category 3 when it made landfall, but remains one of the most costly and deadly hurricanes to date. And a bit more recently, Hurricane Sandy was not even ranked on the Saffir-Simpson scale and was below a Category 1. However, when it hit New York, that damage, that impact was not accurately accounted for, and this didn't account for the hurricane's large speed, the large size, and the record-setting amounts of rain that were caused by Sandy. Fortunately, there are solutions to these issues. It just means we have to pay a bit more attention to certain facets of hurricane reporting, or maybe even work to build a new scale from scratch. To start, we should think about ways to work with the vocabulary and terms that we have. Two terms that you see often thrown around are hurricane watch and hurricane warning. So something that helps me think about it, hurricane watch means that hurricane level winds and rain are possible within the next 2 days. So I like to think about it as sort of the ingredients for the hurricane cake are there. A hurricane warning means that hurricane level winds and rain are imminent within the next 36 hours. It's basically saying those ingredients have assembled into your hurricane cake that's on the way. To better approach storm safety, we should familiarize ourselves with some of the graphics and terms that are essential in hurricane reporting. As previously mentioned, one of the most damaging parts of the storm is the storm surge, which is an indicator of the rise of water levels. This map here was generated for Hurricane Katrina with redder areas showing higher storm surges. And it's insane to note how this map notes up to a 24 feet increase in water levels. It's also important to note that these maps don't account for any tide variations for high or low tide. So this means that this 24-foot increase could be on top of high tide levels. Another important graphic you often see in hurricane reporting is the cone of uncertainty, which represents the most probable track of the center of the storm over the next 5 days. The forecasted dates are marked along the side of the cone, and as the dates go on, the range of the cone gets wider and wider. This is because the forecast uncertainty does get wider over time. The cone represents 2/3 of the historical error, which in statistical jargon means that the center of this cone will remain, the center of the storm will remain in the cone about 60 to 70% of the time. However, it's important to note that this cone does not represent just the opinion of some particular agency or one forecaster, and it's sort of the consensus among NOAA. And it's also important to note that this cone will not change over the duration of the reporting of the storm. It's also important to note that the cone does not mean that the hurricane's impacts will just be felt inside the cone. Look at all the hurricane watches and warnings from Florida up to North Carolina on this graphic. For a scale to be effective, we should try to strike a balance between simplicity and comprehension, and striking the balance here can be difficult. At one end of the spectrum, there are indices like the Waffle House Index, which ranks hurricanes by how badly they affect the service of Waffle House. So here the scale goes from green, which the Waffle House is open, everything is fine, to red here, meaning that the Waffle House is closed or just gone entirely. This scale is pretty easy to understand, but it's not very comprehensive. On the other end of the spectrum, there are complex, comprehensive indices like the aptly named Tropical Cyclone Severity Scale, designed by Blumendahl in 2021. This has some similarities to the Saffir-Simpson scale, at least in its original form. There are 3 scales here, each ranked 0 to 5, and they follow the pattern of no damage at 0 to catastrophic damage at 5. And the categories for these storms are sort of based on historical storms. To get a final score, the categories for these 3 are calculated, are interpolated to make a scale overall 0 to 5, with a special category 6 reserved for storms that exceed category 5 in 2 categories. As an example, Katrina would be ranked a 5 overall in this scale, ranking as a 3 in wind speed scale and a 2 in rainfall, but a 5 in a storm surge, making it a category 5 overall. In summary, just some takeaways. The Saffir-Simpson scale is one of the most used hurricane severity ranking scales, and it's solely based upon wind speeds. However, this ignores the most dangerous part of hurricanes, the storm surge, and can make storms seem less dangerous to the public. To respond to storms better, we should pay more attention to hurricane watches and warnings, stay updated on our storm surge news, and know how to read a cone of uncertainty. Or we could design a system that's easy to understand while also being comprehensive. All right, thank you for listening. Stay safe, y'all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peyton and Matthew. Are there any questions in the chat or people who are online? While you think about your questions, I am gonna drop one more thing in the chat. If you're paying attention, you'll see that there's additional code words. I've also dropped links and dates for our next 3 intern chats, so you can copy those to your calendars.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
First, thank you, Peyton and Matthew, for your presentation. I learned a lot. And I'm just curious on this topic. What surprised you most when you were researching for this? I'll let you both answer that. And Peyton, I understand meteorology is kind of in your background, so this might have been a driving thing for you, but it's always fun to learn something new.
So to be completely honest, I didn't realize how big of an issue this was when I first started. I knew about it and I knew it was a thing, but when I started doing research, I was like, wow, there's a lot of published material and studies on what we've done to kind of figure out what's the best course of action. I know a lot of the information we have about the tropical cyclone severity scale actually came from a study that was asking participants to kind of rate the scales and what did they like about them, what did they not, trying to figure out, can we change this? It's really interesting to see the intersection of public response to hurricane warnings and maybe what's the most effective, because we are so used to the Saffir-Simpson scale and it's been around for 50 years. We relate hurricane intensity and hurricane damage to the rating that we're given, even though maybe that's not quite right, but it was really interesting to see how much research has been done, how we're trying to figure out what's the best approach to this, because we know there's an issue and how do we fix it, and it's really interesting to see that.
For sure. Going off of the public safety and the public response, I think a really interesting thing from researching about this was the sort of discrepancy between a lot of storms I've seen is like really dangerous and infamous versus like how they were ranked on the Saffir-Simpson. Hurricane Katrina's ranking was really surprising to me, and Hurricane Sandy's as well, because I think of those as really like catastrophic, like city changing, area changing floods. But in like Sandy's case, it wasn't even on the scale. So it really highlighted like these storms are not being like the scale that we have right now doesn't do these storms justice. And I think that that's shaping a lot of people's responses.
And do have thank you for that. And by the way, I mean, when I completely knew nothing about this until I kind of saw your prep for this. So I really have learned an awful lot. Matthew, in the one of your slides, you showed a metric. I think that you'd said that there was some public feedback on it. That's wind speed, storm surge, and it has those different ratings. And you had said that Hurricane Katrina would have been a 5 under that scale. Am I to understand that, it's the worst of one of those 3 categories is what makes it a 5? I couldn't exactly follow how that worked. Because the wind speeds for that one seemed a little bit lower, but it still would have been a 5. So are you understanding my question?
I am. I think the like way they interpreted that was they assigned a numerical value to each of like the 0 to 5 scales. And so I think that the 3 and the 2 and wind speed and a rainfall respectively, I think that would have been enough to just push it to the category 5. And again, the 5 on the what is it? The storm surge, I think that would have bumped it up above that threshold, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. I sorry to take all the air. So like I said, I have all these questions. So thinking about the fact that someone who's been around, I grew up not far from the coast. I've lived through an awful lot of hurricanes. All my family's still on the coast. And I can without a doubt tell you they're like category 3. Yeah, we're just going to shelter in place. And so when I hear these other things, it really is kind of shocking. My question is, if we were to, as a citizenship, say we really need better rating systems, do you have any sense, is that NOAA that should take the charge? I mean, who would really kind of be the lead on this, or do we not know? And that's part of the reason that most of us are just so uninformed.
I do think part of the issue is not knowing because this is kind of uncharted waters. The Saffir-Simpson is, like I said, what we've always used, and I think it's always been assumed. I think my personal opinion is that we would probably see a joint effort from different things. I think FEMA would be involved in this case because that has so much impact on the public outreach side of things. I think a lot of the science side would come from things like NOAA and maybe some independent researchers too. We're seeing a lot of independent research going on, a lot of studies published, so there's certainly research on it. So I think it would maybe be a combination of impact, of influences on what we decided to do, and definitely I think it would be influenced by the public because I know I mentioned earlier there's a lot of studies on there about how the public reacts to these new systems. And I think that's very important because if we are going to create a new system, it needs to be easily understandable, but it also needs to maybe account for more than our Saffir-Simpson scale already does, which is definitely an adjustment period. And we definitely need to have the public input on how they're going to react to it. Like, they're not going to understand it, it becomes useless. I think that'll be what happens. I don't know if Matthew has anything to add on that.
I'm going to close it off because we're just about time with one last question that's in the chat here. And it's, what can be done to ensure preparedness in communities for disasters?
In the course of researching this project, one of our like bosses, Miss Wendy Weber, really helped us with this. And she said the number one thing is to have like a readiness plan ready, like sort of know where you can go in your community to find certain things, know your shelter spaces, know where water and food could be maybe found. And again, just sort of have like those connections, have a plan in place. I think that's the most important thing.
Also, keeping an eye on your local news stations, particularly the ones that you and I are going to report kind of directly from NOAA so that you can be prepared. Even in the 36 hours leading up to a hurricane, you can still do a lot. You have time to get yourself out still. So knowing, like Matthew said, what resources are available to you, maybe having a disaster kit in place that you can pick up and go if you were to need to, if you're in a region with shorter term disasters, and hurricanes like tornadoes, having a plan. Where do I go if this is to happen? Where do I go if we get a watch or a warning or something like that? So having that preparedness, and then knowing who you can contact also, I think would help. Where do you go when you have nowhere to go type thing? And who do you ask when you need assistance with something? So having that kind of personal plan in place, and then also keeping an eye on the larger scale government officials, news outlets, reliable news outlets specifically. NOAA sources are probably one of the best ones to look at, and understanding those graphics like the cone of uncertainty, like we talked about. And that's only one of them. Storm surge, flooding maps, things like that are quite important because they can really influence the decision on whether you evacuate, more than just maybe our rating system like we've talked about.
Wonderful. We're at time. Peyton and Matthew, thank you so much for kicking off our Intern Talk series for Campus Sustainability Month. Giving you a round of applause. Thanks for everyone for joining us. I hope you'll join us again for our next talk, which is on October the 18th. It's Wolves, Bison, and Bears, oh my, a history of our national parks. Really appreciate you joining us, and remember to send those code words in for Campus Sustainability Month. Have a great day, everyone.